All right, let's go ahead and get going. Welcome to the solar afternoon session. This is obviously a hot topic here in Virginia, some very ambitious goals here in the Commonwealth, up to 2,000 megawatts within the next 5 years here, and there's also a goal by some of our major utilities for up to 5,000 megawatts. So there's quite a bit for us to talk about. What we're going to do is we're going to have one presentation at a time, 3 presentations that are going to cover really the life cycle of solar development, from siting and planning and development all the way through decommissioning. I think you'll see that you're going to get a complete picture of the challenges of developing solar, but also the benefits of solar. So we're going to jump right into it. The first speaker is going to be Jonah Fogel. He's a program manager for University of Virginia's Environmental Resilience Institute. Please join me in welcoming Jonah.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you here at Environment Virginia. It's always been a sort of a nerdy dream of mine to be able to stand on this stage. I know it's not as cool as being a rock star in most circles, but for me it's enjoyable. So I have a background in natural resource policy and planning. I did not see myself, however, working in solar siting and permitting. However, you know, the world changes and you had to change with it. And so back in the summer of 2016, I found myself getting requests from local government at the time, inquiring about solar siting and permitting. And so since then, I've kind of dragged myself along in learning about how these technologies are actually being experienced, both at local government scales, but also at the state government, and also thinking regionally as far away as North Carolina and how they've kind of developed over time as well. So my goal this afternoon is to simply transmit to you a little bit of what I understand about solar in Virginia, but I fully expect that some of you are wrestling with some issues around solar as well. So hopefully some of what I'm saying is accurate, and if it's not, please inform my discretion as well. I am going to go talk a little bit about sort of where we're at energy-wise in Virginia, a little bit about how solar policy is constructed in the state, where local governments fit into that picture, and the sort of lessons learned and best practices about how to address solar, and then sort of more broadly about how my program, the Environmental Resilience Institute, and UVA writ large is sort of trying to work inside of these issues to make sure that everybody has what they need to advance both the state of the technology and the economy of renewable energy. So you can see here, this is some data from the Energy Information Agency, the federal agency. Renewables are at 7% of our total generating capacity, or net generating capacity. That's up from 6% in 2017, so there's an advance, I guess, for Virginia. But the preponderance of energy still comes from natural gas fired generators and also nuclear. Coal has, of course, been declining for years, and we're continuing to see that trend. Solar power is really gaining a lot of traction now since about 2014. We've seen large increases year over year. This graph comes from the Virginia Energy Plan and really points out sort of that light blue color about how much on year we can see in terms of solar development. Obviously, you can see the light blue being sort of utility scale solar as being the largest percentage of that overall picture. But we also have non-commercial, sort of residential stuff, and commercial in the yellow. All of this development for solar is really being driven by 3 things. We have a very hungry economy looking for more energy of all kinds, of course, solar being a part of that. You also have large industrial and commercial users, especially in Virginia. We have a lot of data centers with Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and all the rest looking for green energy. Solar is a great opportunity for them to meet their internal market, so they're trying to set their own goals. And then, of course, by virtue of this nice cycle coming where people are demanding green energy and lots of it coming online, the procedures and the ability standing up a project and getting it on the ground is all the cost structures inside of that, as well as the cheaper and cheaper technology, means that the economics of solar works really well now. As we heard about in the introduction, we do have a lot of solar hitting the ground, and there's a lot in the queue that isn't currently permitted, but it's on its way to being permitted. Sort of the largest figure that we have here is looking at the PJM interconnection. That's sort of this large regional part of the national energy grid. They're looking at 10 gigawatts, actually sort of in the permitting process for Virginia. Not all of that will get built. We're currently coming up on about 1 gigawatt. But that's obviously sort of tells you a little bit about the trend line about how fast this solar market is developing. There are lots of different sort of subsegments of the solar market, and solar developers, if you're in the room, probably spend a lot of time talking about where the money is to be made, and thinking how do we make projects that are not going to drag down a company but build it up, right? So we have sort of 4 major components to that. There's the net metering market, which could be residential, non-residential, which have different sort of size classifications inside of that. There's also little carve-outs. So we have the ag generator designation within the Code of Virginia, and that has to do with power being generated on farm for the use by the farm operation, but there are certain limitations sort of built into that net metering idea, which make it specific to farm generators. And then, of course, you have power purchase agreements, which get used by the nonprofit and school communities. There's some pilot projects that were passed through legislation last year and the year before. Community solar, however you want to define that, is really about the idea of aggregation of purchase of a solar array, the power that comes off of a single power array. And then the one that's taking up probably the most energy in the room right now, policy-wise, is utility scale solar. And so I'm going to focus a little bit more of my presentation on that piece, utility scale solar. And then there's a side note at the bottom that talks about energy storage. I haven't been following this terribly closely myself, but apparently the cost structures on energy storage, whether it's battery or other technologies, is rapidly decreasing and making certain things practical probably in the next 18 months that we wouldn't have otherwise seen. So we can see sort of municipal scale storage, large storage arrays coming up, and changing where solar fits into the energy economy. We can see that there are various sizes of what we think of as utility scale solar. I have here in the little red dot, that's us. And if you wanted to get a sense of how big these things can be or generally are, if you go out and you look at the parade grounds from this building, you can kind of look out over the parade grounds, and that's sort of generally pointed down to where Route 11 connects with Main Street. And this orange box is a 25 megawatt, or sorry, pardon me, a 20 megawatt site, which is about 125 acres. And if you stand on the sort of the front steps of this building and look out over the parade grounds, you can, by sort of as the crow flies, get to about the intersection of Main and 11th. And that's how big about one side of that project area would be. So these things can have a pretty substantial footprint land use wise. The largest, and this is probably something you all are aware of, but the largest solar installation on the East Coast, east of the Rockies, is currently going through the permitting process at the local level in Spotsylvania County. That project has a disturbed area of 3,500 acres. That's about the land area we could expect to be under panel. The actual total project's site is actually a little over 6,300 acres. So that light blue box is roughly the size of the project under panel, and it's a little over 2 times the size of the city of Lexington. So if you wanted to kind of get a sense of how big these projects that are being proposed are, that's the biggest one on the East Coast. Those are more typically found on the west side of the country. But you can get about, for every megawatt, you need about 10 acres. It's sort of a rough calculation. Some instances you can be more efficient with the land than that, but that's a good rough figure. However, if that concerns you, the size component to this, I think maybe it's worth pointing out that there are limitations and there's a marketplace for these projects. They're not, not everyone is going to live next to a solar array when this trend is over. There is an economic fittedness to solar in Virginia, and we have competing land uses. So the land at some point will be too expensive. The substations will be overburdened. The transmission lines won't be able to necessarily take on all the power being generated. So at some point, there's a balancing here of where solar fits into the energy economy. That being said, there's multiple concerns, right? So not just about the transmission and the production of power, but also how does that power kind of get put into the landscape is a good question, especially for local governments, where they have competing issues of where are the houses going to go, where are we going to have different land uses, and how does solar fit into that mix? Those conversations are currently ongoing and are probably likely to keep going for the next couple of years until we get our heads around, what does a project really mean for a community? And what are the trade-offs inside of that? So especially on the eastern side of the state where we have the Chesapeake Bay, water quality issues that you just heard about in the last session, as an important policy consideration, what does it mean to have solar be as a land use inside of that area as well? We haven't necessarily digested that, so I think there's a little bit of research that we need to do that's specific to this area of the world. But there are also political considerations and just sort of sentiment issues with misconceptions about what solar is, what it's not, what the risks are of permitting and approving these projects. I won't go through all of these, but these are some of the issues that people, especially the general citizenry, need to get familiar with. Right? So there has been a lot of research that's been done about PV panels, the implications from everything from heat island effects to ecological disturbance, sound, glare, all kinds of things. Becoming more familiar with the implications of the technology, both from the layperson's perspective, but also from the sort of public administration side is going to be an important part of our sort of understanding of solar in the land. Ultimately, we do have to get to a place where we're using solar as any other land use would be cited and permitted, right? So it doesn't matter if it's a Walmart distribution point or a strip mall or a solar array. All of those land uses go through the same public policy process. And so there are constraints on what that looks like and sort of guidance from the state in terms of legislation that puts together a lot of classifications. And I think maybe the one takeaway that you might want to feel from this slide is that there's lots of different sizes, both in terms of land area disturbance, but also in generating capacity, which is baked directly into the Code of Virginia, which has implications for local governments especially in thinking about what is their responsibility, what are the implications, and how these things are actually imposing themselves on a community. But also from the development side, right? Where's the sweet spot? How big does a project really need to be able to make ends meet so that we're taking care of making a profitable project? And so I talked about how the 20 megawatts is really sort of the average size project. And that's in part dictated by public policy and how it's been construed over the last maybe decade or so. But you have these two major classifications, small solar scale and then large, and really the determination between the two is that large includes the sort of oversight of the SCC. The one that's garnering a lot of attention right now is sort of this third level within the smaller classification, and it invokes this permit by rule application process. Before you get to 5 megawatts or 10 areas of disturbed land, you can pretty much get by with local government land use certification, which is a pretty typical rezoning process, and the local government controls that, and certainly then DEQ is just notified. However, when you get into the permit by rule application process, that's where DEQ starts to work with the developer, works with the other agencies like historic resources, conservation and recreation, environmental quality. So all of those considerations can be thought through and the implications for a large land disturbance. However, it's a review and approval process. So you get into circumstances where it's approved unless mitigating measures need to be agreed to, and then it goes forward as well. So it's a bit of an expedited process, which there's a lot of clarification that needs to be made there. in terms of educating local governments, but also citizens, and why these things are sort of walking through a process, and what does that process mean? Where can they intersect with that and understand themselves in the process? This is the PBR, all the components of it that need to be put in place. So this is, if you speak with Beth Major over at DEQ, who's the person who's in charge of the PBR process, she's got a long queue of solar projects that need to be vetted, worked through with agencies, and then have all these components met, and if it meets all the checklists, then the project can go forward and is approved. One of the pieces in that is the local government certification, and that's where a lot of these projects are finding a lot of negotiation. So the development community and the local governments are really in the control of the siting and permitting process. And I'll very quickly go through a number of these things. But here you have the Planning Commission being responsible for the sort of hearing the permit, and if it passes and is recommended up to the Board of Supervisors or to City or Town Council, then it goes to the Board of Supervisors for their actual legislative action in approving the zoning and approving the process going forward, providing the local certification. There are a lot of different impacts that could be put into a community. So there needs to be some consideration here before proposals are coming in the door about where do you want solar in your community? Are there sensitive areas, sensitive views, conservation goals? All of those things need to be thought through. And it's just a matter of saying, you know, to yourself, how does this fit with our comprehensive plan? How would our zoning ordinance need to be amended? And then how can we work with the development community inside of a conditional use process or something like that, where you get a better sense of what would cause the project to move forward, ameliorate some of the misconceptions about where solar could have negative consequences, and mitigate those things. So this is, you know, typical public administration kinds of stuff. But I will say that there's the comp plan and zoning subdivision ordinance. All these things are brought to bear on this land use just like anything else. The state does provide some model ordinances that you can use to kind of get a better litany of or a list of things that need to be considered inside of that. Those are available on the DEQ website. But I am familiar with Ken German, who's the renewables program manager at DMME, and they're interested in sort of rethinking the model ordinances, and how is what we're doing in Virginia consonant, different, need to be thought through differently with regard to what's happened in North Carolina and what the marketplace is proposing. There are lots of good resources out there to help local governments through this thought process. SolSmart offers sort of best practices in zoning for solar, but there are others. And we are going to be a party in Virginia that hopefully will be providing ongoing technical assistance for local government, but also hopefully consulting with the state, helping to bring more technical understanding of what solar and its implications are. So I represent the Environmental Resilience Institute, but we're working very closely with the Weldon Cooper Center for Public Service. There are researchers and graduate students and all the rest of that stuff that are currently working on things like the implications economically, land use trade-offs for solar. But we're also expanding and looking at other opportunities for thinking about energy writ large. So we're talking about load balancing, innovative materials for storage, sort of advanced materials, and even thinking beyond renewables and even energy to the implications of energy. So we actually have researchers working on negative emissions technologies and actually pulling carbon out of the air versus having low carbon generation energy sources. So we're thinking broadly about all these kinds of things, and we're developing partnerships with North Carolina's Clean Energy Center, and hopefully being able to provide a lot of technical guidance, documentation, publications, webinars, workshops. We did a solar summit last fall, which I think was very useful and constructive and brought all the different policy actors to the table. So we do have the video of all the lectures from that event available on the ERI website, which we invite you to go explore. And if you would like to talk with me more, you can find me online and find me on Twitter. I'm happy to chat with anyone about this or other environmental issues. We have great researchers that we work with, and we really focus on interdisciplinary science, interdisciplinary research that spans everything from music and law to business and environmental science. We bring all these researchers together based on the problem, based on the understanding that the world needs, and we provide that actionable science that drives the process forward. So with that, I will leave you, and I think our next speaker is just about ready. Oh, a couple questions, okay. As a public administration guy, definitely bored the audience to tears, and they're just all asleep. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great questions. So the first one about sort of where is the growth curve heading and where do we level off at in terms of percentage of the total energy pie? I don't know that I have an answer for that, although I work with a researcher who's in charge of the sort of economics research within Weldon Cooper, and they are working on specifically that question. And then thinking, once we sort of see this growth curve potential, what are the trade-offs in terms of land use, community development issues, and sort of building out our picture based off of that economic sort of forecasting. So please stay in touch. I'd be interested to talk with you about that. The second question about recycling, my understanding is almost exclusively the technology that's finding its way into these solar sites is highly recyclable. About 90% of it is recyclable product. So whether it's glass or silicon, those kinds of things can be reused. And so there is an efficiency in making sure your panels are operating at sort of top capacity. And so those panels are changed out as they're damaged. They're often stockpiled and those kinds of things now, but there is a recycling market that's developing. It's much more pronounced in Europe than it is here, but we do see signs that that recycling market is coming up. And there's actually some research that we're going to be working with NCSU on to think about how that can be developed over time as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm going to leave that to the development community to talk about in terms of where that sweet spot is for the business side of things. It's certainly something that does get done. The sort of frequency and the scale at which it gets done is something that I think that the development community is acutely aware of and can probably more adequately answer for you. But yeah, I can say for the University of Virginia, we're moving both in terms of utility scale stuff, ground mounted, but also looking at rooftops on the university and thinking about how that can offset some of our unused space as well.
That's all the time we got, so now we got to jump to the next presentation. But thank you, Jonah. Okay, we're going to have a quick transition here. And everything just disappeared on us. Right here? Okay. Click on the box. I'm clicking on the box. I'm clicking on the box. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, that's weird.
Okay, while we're working through these technical difficulties here, so we just talked about permitting. We're going to stretch your brains a little bit. Now we're going to go all the way to the end of the line, talk about decommissioning. This gentleman that's working the mouse here to my right is John Hillis, president and co-founder of SolUnesco. So he's going to give you a full gamut of information about what happens after the site's been developed and you've got all your useful life out of the solar farm. So welcome John to the stage.
as Donnie said, I'm president of SolUnesco. We're a utility-scale solar developer operating primarily in Virginia. I sit on the Virginia Solar Energy Development Authority. I'm a former board member of MDVCA. And I am going to also touch on some of the solar siting aspects that I think the previous presenter talked about, and kind of tie into the next presentation as well, not just on decommissioning. And I want to get back to the question about parking garages and canopy solar and that sort of thing. It really comes down to the market. If it fits in within the market and it's cost effective, and the utility will buy power at that rate those facilities would be able to sell into the grid, and we as consumers would be willing to buy power at that rate, then yeah, it's game on. But right now, the cost of doing large-scale solar over a parking garage or a large parking lot would be about 50% more than it would be for a utility-scale solar project. So that's really what's driving that, and not letting that become a market that you're really seeing expand. So I think it really comes down to the decisions we want to make as a society. If we want to say that that's what we want to do, then we should just go ahead and do it and pay the price for it. So that's kind of what's going on there, if that answers your question. Okay. So as I said, SolUnesco is a utility-scale solar. We're operating primarily in Virginia. We're considering expanding to other states right now. 10 projects in Virginia in development in 10 different counties, totaling almost 1,000 megawatts, 1 gigawatt in generation. And of those 10 projects in Virginia, 6 have gone through local permitting. So we have a lot of experience in dealing with a lot of the issues that the previous presenter was talking about, the county ordinances, the decommissioning costs, how we're calculating that, and working through issues with the local communities, making sure that we're addressing all their concerns in the development of our projects. So I want to just look at a high-level overview of what we consider when we're developing a project, where we're developing, what size the project's going to be, and what the issues are in consideration of those factors. Location, size, site, so we can just kind of go through those quickly. So when you're looking at where you're going to develop, we're considering what RTO, such as PJM, we want to develop in, what are their interconnection study costs, what is the interconnection deposit. PJM has a relatively low interconnection deposit compared to some other RTOs, but they require site control. Some RTOs that don't require site control have a very high deposit for the study. So there's kind of a balancing act there. What state do you want to work with? You want to work in a state that doesn't have any energy policy regarding renewables, and they're just letting the market drive it, kind of what we have here in Virginia? Or do you want to work in a state that is requiring, where you're going to have to look at the SREC value, the value of the solar renewable energy credits in the development of your project? When you do that, then it creates more uncertainty regarding the costs that you're associating with your project. So it makes it a little bit more tricky. We don't have that in Virginia, so we don't worry about the values of the SRECs. And then the Public Utility Commission, what their process is, will we have to be permitted? Will we have to get a CPCN through the Public Utility Commission? In Virginia, up to 150 megawatts, we don't need to do that. We can go through the DEQ permit by rule process. So that's why, as the previous presenter said, a lot of those projects you're seeing are at 150, and then beyond that, it jumps right up to 250 and 500. And then the locality, what you have to look at the county's ordinances. What are the requirements? If they have a solar ordinance that specifically prohibits utility-scale solar development, then you're not going to that county. You're not going to develop in that county, or you may have a discussion with them as to why that is, and maybe they would be willing to amend their ordinance. And then the last thing on here, decommissioning cost and salvage value and required security by the locality. There's, in Virginia, a wide variation there, and it's creating a great deal of uncertainty and confusion in our industry. And I'm going to touch on that in more detail as we move forward. So, and I'm not going to get into this into detail because I want to get to the decommissioning information. This goes through factors to consider when you're looking at a geographical area that you, or regarding size, I'm sorry. And one of the things Virginia would deal with size is you have a sweet spot really at 20 megawatts. You have a sweet spot at 150 megawatts. 20 megawatts, you can interconnect at distribution level. You may find a substation with a 150-acre, 200-acre property right nearby where you can interconnect at a relatively low cost, and it makes the cost per watt of that interconnection very, very good and marketable. And then at 150, you're capping out your DEQ permit by rule process as opposed to going into the CPCN process with the SCC. And the interconnection costs we're seeing for at 115 kV lines of a 150 megawatt project are similar to what we're seeing for the 20 megawatt projects at the distribution 34.5 kV level. So those are really kind of comparable in cost per watt interconnections. And again, I'm going to go on to the next slide here because we're time. And then regarding your site, these are a lot of the parameters we evaluate when we're looking at specific sites. The transmission, the property value, the acreage, proximity to residential developments, obviously the zoning. Does it fit in with the comprehensive plan? We have to do, one of the first things we do in developing a project when we go to the county is it goes through the 2232 review to verify that it is substantially in accord with their comprehensive plan. The counties by law, by state code, have to do that evaluation. So we do that before we even go through the permitting process. And then the environmental and physical characteristics of the site, wetlands and slope are the two, and floodplain, they're the main issues that we deal with. And then threatened and endangered species and cultural resources. We deal with grave sites. We have to work around them. We have to allow access of those grave sites to family members that want to come visit their deceased relatives. And then previous uses of the property, we'll be doing phase 1 and phase 2 ESA on sites to make sure that there was no toxic landfill on that site previously. You haven't come across that yet, but you never know. Most of the sites that we're working with currently are forest land, timber properties. And they've been that way for decades or maybe even centuries. So getting into decommissioning and the life cycle of a project, first 3 to 5 years we're dealing with project development. This is for a large scale project such as like 100 to 150 megawatt project. The smaller 20 megawatt projects typically can get through development in maybe a couple years, maybe 18 months. The larger projects take much longer. And then project operation, although people have heard numbers of 20 to 25 years these panels will be on operation. The current industry thought is that these will be in operation for 30 to 40 years. You may hit a point 20 years down the road where it makes sense to swap out all the panels and put new panels out there that have a higher efficiency. But we'll have to wait and see how the technology develops moving forward. And then project decommissioning, which will take about a year, where we remove everything and restore the site to its original condition as required by the county the decommissioning plan that we submit to the county and is approved with our permit. So what is decommissioning? This is the definition that was inserted into recently signed by the governor, House Bill 20, actually was signed, I think, before midnight last night, which was the deadline. So there was never any question whether or not he was going to sign it, but anyway, it recently was enacted. House Bill 2651, that's the definition there. It's pretty self-explanatory. And then down below it, just kind of what we have to do. And the county can put certain conditions on us in our decommissioning plan that we have to comply with, and we negotiate that during the permitting process. Excuse me. And then these are the items that are typically included in the permitting plan. In the decommissioning plan, the life of the project, the cost of the decommissioning, physical plan for decommissioning, and then either financial security in the form of a bond or a letter of credit or a cash escrow really needs to be, for that decommissioning value, needs to be required by the county to verify that that's actually going to get done. If the project owner goes out of business or the project goes into default, the county needs to be able to restore that land to its existing conditions. So why is a decommissioning plan, why do we need this? The counties require it. They want to make sure that they're covered, their interests are covered, that the site's going to be restored to its original conditions. And as a developer, we need to do it anyway. We need to figure out what it's going to cost us to do that at the end of the project, and what our potential value is of our salvage value is of our recycled content. And we include that in the cost of decommissioning. Sometimes you might have a situation where actually we anticipate the salvage value of the equipment to be higher than the actual decommissioning costs. Counties don't like that. They would rather see it the other way around, so they actually have some sort of security that it's going to be done. That's one of the issues we're dealing with right now, trying to figure out how we calculate that salvage value in conjunction with the decommissioning plan to make sure the counties have enough of a security to verify that the decommissioning is going to be performed. Now, what does all this mean? It really comes down to a lot of uncertainty in the industry. Counties are doing different things. We have to dig down at the county level and talk to the planning directors, talk to the planning commissioners, the board of supervisors, and figure out what conditions they are going to impose on us regarding decommissioning, so we can really determine if we want to develop in that county, number one, and if we do, what are the costs of that development going to be. So that's what we did. We did a very thorough analysis of all the counties in Virginia, and all the projects that have been permitted at the county level in Virginia, and determined what the conditions for decommissioning were imposed on them through either a permit or through the actual ordinances in the county. And I'm not going to go through each one of these categories here, but you can see it's kind of all over the place what counties are requiring, and there is no cross-section of anything. So, and the cost estimate of the salvage value, again, some counties are including it, some counties are not. And in most cases, like as I stated, salvage values are estimated to be higher than the actual decommissioning costs, making it unreasonable to think that a project would ever be abandoned. Even if a project is abandoned by a developer, the county, in theory, should have enough value in that existing material to cover the cost of decommissioning. Regardless, it's still an uncertainty, and the county wants to be covered, and that's why we're saying that, yes, we should provide some sort of financial security, either in a bond or letter of credit or cash escrow. Now I'm going to go through this folder, and this gives an example on some of the, decommissioning for 35 years. The cost is $10 million. Discounted salvage value is $8 million. We would provide a security, probably in a letter of credit, of $2 million. The project developers typically shy away from cash escrow for obvious reasons. Don't want to have that money tied up. And this goes through some of the, again, some of the recommendations for the financial security, performance bond, letter of credit, cash escrow, parent guarantee. If you have, a lot of the projects are a certain name, Solar LLC, and they're owned by a parent company. Well, they don't want that generation facility LLC to be providing the security. They want the parent company to be providing that guarantee. So that's what's going to be provided here. Parent guarantee will be providing that security. And now, this all means we worked with a number of the counties and the Rubin Group, which is a group that's been coordinating. It's a stakeholder group that has interest in utility scale solar development in Virginia. That's, I think, some of the counties or some of the county representation organizations are members, and utilities are members, and the utility scale solar industry are members. And this is one of the things that they tackled this session. My business partner, Francis Hodsell, is a member of that group, and he helped work on this bill, 2621, which gives the counties a direction on what to do regarding decommissioning costs and what they can do. It doesn't really say what they can't do. It just says this is what you should do. And a slide here on the impact of solar in Virginia, the jobs it's creating, the amount of revenue, and creating a lot of revenue with the M&T taxes and property taxes at the county level as well. And what is really driving this utility scale solar industry in Virginia is we have here with legislation, obviously, enabling legislation stating that right now it's 5 gigawatts of solar utility-scale solar is in the public interest, and the SEC is to liberally interpret their rules to approve these facilities. A lot of these facilities are not going to be approved by the SEC because they will be privately owned and they will be permitted at the DEQ PBR level. But regardless, it creates a market for utility-scale solar purchased by the utilities, Dominion and APCO and ODEC. Military is purchasing solar, and then direct sales. This is, everybody's heard of, obviously Microsoft has entered into a power purchase agreement for a lot of the generation on the Spotsylvania project, which I think the next speaker is going to speak to. And then Amazon has bought the project out in Accomack County on the Eastern Shore, and then another 100 megawatts down in Southampton County. And then Apple and Facebook have committed to purchasing from projects as well. So that's my presentation. I hope I didn't run over. Oh, okay, good. I timed it before, and I was a little over 20 minutes, but okay. So anybody have any questions? Yeah. Why would you? Good question. You may not. I mean, in all likelihood, as I stated before, you have a generation facility there. You have the interconnection already built. That the panels would be removed and new panels would be installed, higher efficiency panels. But regardless, you still have to consider that it may happen. Maybe 30, 40 years from now, through energy efficiency measures, we don't need as much energy as we do right now. And maybe the energy isn't as worth as much, and you might want to decommission that facility. It's hard to gauge what's going to happen, obviously, 30 or 40 years from now. And the counties really need to have an assurance that if it is decommissioned, that the site will be restored to its existing conditions. Yeah. Sure. So without being specific, we were developing in one county, and we were at the, I can't remember if it was the Planning Commission or the Board of Supervisors. One of the commissioners or board members decided to just open questions up to everybody, and it became a public back and forth, and it was a very odd decorum, and even got to the point where one of the board members wanted to take a hand vote of the members in the public hearing who was for and who was against our project, which we thought was totally inappropriate. That was bad. We got through it. We ended up getting our project permitted, and I think the county learned a lesson from that. Some counties have been great to work, and that county eventually was great to work with, and it was just that situation was very strange. We've had a lot of misconceptions about solar out there, and we actually have a white paper that we wrote, I think about a year ago, that you can download from our website. That it's a memo to the counties to address all these misconceptions about utility-scale solar that are brought to them through these public hearings. Because we've heard so many of them about fires, about contaminants, about decommissioning, about these solar arrays occupying over the entire county, which, as the previous presenter stated, it can't happen. There's only so much energy that can be put on the grid, and without ridiculous upgrades to the transmission and the substation. So. That gives you a couple examples, yeah. Anybody else? Oh, okay. Again, Doctor? Oh, I'm sorry, how about over here? I'm sorry. Did you have a question here? Okay, well. Go ahead. No, the average lifespan of a panel is really 30 to 40 years. Some of the manufacturers only warrant 20 to 25 years, so they really should be lasting 30 to 40 years. The first solar cell that was made in Bell Labs, I think back in the 50s, is still generating power. Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to hear directly from a municipal perspective. You know, a lot of these sites, they obviously have their own challenges, but, you know, it's in the public interest to develop solar. There are large swaths of land. There are unavoidable environmental impacts. And municipalities have to wrestle with that. How do they facilitate getting it developed? And this site in Spotsylvania that's going to be discussed next is one of the largest, as you heard earlier, here in the United States, and it's at the epicenter of that struggle between doing the public interest and protecting the environment. So the next speaker is Richard Street. He's an senior environmental engineer with Spotsylvania County, and he's going to walk you through that process that he's in the midst of right now.
Well, good afternoon, and I think the only reason I'm still a senior environmental engineer is I've lasted the longest, so we'll see how well that works. Spotsylvania County, we've got a little bit of a problem, or a project, shall we say, that when it graced our doorstep, we didn't necessarily panic, but we started asking questions as to who can help us. And the answers were, county, take care of it yourself. So we started to look at it, and we started to devise a plan of action for projects that are 400 acres or more. Keep in mind that all localities usually have a limit for erosion, sediment control, stormwater management, things like that. And when you look at their local fee schedules, it only goes up to 100 acres of disturbance, of land disturbance. Most of them don't think of projects larger than that. So we were faced with something that was giving us 4,000 acres of land disturbance. And they wanted to do it all at one time. They wanted to have it done within 15 to 18 months. And we said no. So we started to look at it at a smaller scale, and we put together a fee schedule that would help us. And basically, if it's 400 acres, that's the beginning for large-scale solar or large-scale projects, because we're not just getting solar inquiries, we're getting other projects inquiries that are over 400 acres of disturbance. So we devised a new plan, and our fee schedule now for 400 acres or more is $11,000 a month just for erosion and sediment control inspections every month, and it's got to be paid in advance until the site's completed. So with a project the size I'm going to describe to you here shortly, several 400-acre chunks being rolled over every so often, they are going to pay us $11,000 a month for each 400 acres. Now, the project we have is a small one. It's, a total site we were told originally was 6,500 acres. It's a little shy of that. They want to disturb 4,098 acres to put up 1,800,000 solar panels. Imagine that. Now, you noticed Jonah's slide earlier with 3,500 acres. That's the 1,800,000 solar panels is 2 times the size of the city of Lexington. When we started looking at it, this is what they were telling us. They were going to take out of the 6 watersheds, they wanted to disturb that many acres in each one of the watersheds. We said no more than 400 acres, period, even if it crosses into a watershed. No more than 400 acres. And in our discussions, we finally sat down with them and said, give us a plan of how it's going to work. And we're not sure if the contractor was militant or military personnel or anything in his history. He probably was, because he actually came up with a plan that could work. So I gave you these information a few minutes ago. Again, we were originally told 6,500 acres. What we did was we told them, show us one small section and give us a comprehensive plan of how you want to approach it. So we sat down with them, and this is the plan we came up with. They put up perimeter controls first, right along any hazardous area, basically a wetland, anything that needs to be protected. the perimeter control is not just going to be super silt fence. There's going to be a berm on the uphill side too. So we're doubling it to protect it. And with that, they of course will start clearing a little bit, but it's just enough to get those 2 basins in, or the basins that would be required as a temporary sediment basin, which ultimately most of these temporary sediment basins are going to be made permanent sediment basins or permanent stormwater controls. Our big problem is in Spotsylvania County, we have acid sulfate soils. Our acid sulfate soils, on a temporary measure being the corrugated metal pipes, will allow those pipes to disappear within 10 to 20 years. I mean, not just corrode, but disappear. It is so acidic that it's battery acid, and it's less than battery acid. The pH is so low. And when we started looking at it, we first started saying, we need native plants in here. And they were saying you can't find the native plant seeds. Well, I see 2 booths out here that show us native plant seeds that are readily available to us. And they're not that far from Virginia. And they actually grow our seeds that we can use. So I'm going to give them their cards and say, here, take a look at these guys. But we're looking at it from this aspect that once the basins are in, they can actually start, come on, click it. There we go. Going to the next section with the perimeter controls and get to the new basins. And while they're working on those, they can start finally clearing an area. Now keep in mind, this is just a schematic of describing a plan of action. There's no way they're going to clear all those slopes. Some of these slopes are 1-to-1 slopes out here. We know they're going to work at the tops. We know most of the land that's going to be disturbed. Originally, when the plan first came in, had a lot of grading, and we said no. We said low impact development or better site design says go with the contours. Well, their new plan now is to go with the contours and just remove the roots of the trees that were timbered for part of the timbering process and project. Well, with that, of course, they'll have to remove any of the scrub brush that's been sitting there, because most of this timbering has occurred over a 4 to 6 year period. So 2 years of growth, and all my forestry folks are going to sit there and say, that's what we're looking for, and it's good for the BMPs, it's good for the buffers, because the new growth is actually taking more pollutant up and more rain up every time it rains. Every time it rains, any pollution is getting absorbed by your plants. That's the big key. It's called evapotranspiration. We've been following it for 30 years now and using it quite often. With these sites, though, this is the process we proposed for them. And we said we are not going to allow more than 400 acres, period. Not just per watershed. They've tried to get that put into some of the approvals, and we've stood by our guns, and we're saying no. It's 400 acres, period. Because we estimated it would take, if we had a rain event, now knowing the DEQ regulations, after every storm event within 48 hours, we have to be out there, the locality and our inspectors have to be out there to check the site, see if there are any failures, any blowouts. Well, I have a staff of 3 inspectors. So we are using our subcontract engineers, who are also our stormwater VSMP inspectors, and we're going to be able to mobilize anywhere from 10 to 20 people to be out there after a rain event to go over the almost 10 miles of perimeter control for this entire project. 10 miles of perimeter control. That was another figure we didn't look at or think about at first. And when you start looking at it from a construction site, that's why we throttled it down to the 400 acres. There's no inspection unit, or a number of engineers you can get out to a site for 10 acres of perimeter control, knowing that most of your slopes are 1-to-1. And you've got fallen trees that are still sitting there that you got to get over, past, and around. Well, granted, we're going to try and do the drones and things like that and have ATVs available for us. But even with that, we got to get to them, and the contractor has to get to them to repair them. But we have to get to them to inspect them and see what kind of impacts have occurred to our wetlands and possible endangered species. There's one on here that Spotsylvania, it's near and dear to us, and that's freshwater mussels. It's the last bastion of freshwater mussels in Spotsylvania County. Our big key is we've been trying to reintroduce freshwater mussels, and we're creating a mussel farm because of Dr. Bass from University of Mary Washington said, Massaponax Creek's mussels are gone, except we found one, and the Corps' helping us, and they're standing behind us saying, yes, protect that last bastion of mussel farm, or mussels. Problem is, any sediment load could destroy the entire lot at one shot, and there's nothing we could do. So that's why we beefed up the perimeter controls, that's why we required the basins to be placed first, and that's why we were saying only 400 acres at a time. And as they go through the process, they're going to follow the same process itself, but when they get to the second 400 acres, that first 400 acres has to be stabilized. And we're going to keep pushing it that way, the whole site. And then they continue on down their path. Now, looking at the entire site again, these are the different watersheds and the acreages that are being impacted in each watershed. Now, granted, most of the solar panels are going to be located in that, literally that upper central portion, because that's where the station is that they have to tie into. And that site right there was the slide we just saw of just the sample area. It was right there at that triangle. So you can see the size of this site is massive. So during all this, we started to ask a lot of questions, and DCR and DEQ, man, they jumped up and they said, let's help you. And they turned around, they started putting together things for us to help us out. And the first thing they did was help us with the pollinators. So the DEQ website has Solar Native Plant Finder. So in other words, this is meant for a solar field. It will not grow up over 36 inches. The plants are native pollinators, so you'll bring back the insects that will bring back the certain kind of birds that we've lost in Virginia for many years, because a lot of people don't realize the things that they're calling weeds in their yards are actually native Virginia plants, and they don't realize it. They keep wanting to take them out and kill them with Roundup or anything, and they don't realize that they're native plants because they grow better in our soils. So DEQ and DCR put this website together to help us out. And I believe VHB is the one who's got the list or the information that will help us. But then we also have the invasive list. Now, this is something that threw me for a loop, and I heard about it years ago. Now, I've been doing this for 41 years. I started in Stafford County. And when I started, I didn't think anything of it. Our erosion sediment control handbook was yellow. Then it went to pink. Then it went to brown. Now it's green, but it hadn't changed since 1995. So we got to do something. Well, one thing I noticed was most of the list of our erosion sediment control grasses that we use are invasive. And the farmers have been telling us that for years. And at a local level, we said, well, it's the list we're given at the state. And at the time, at the state level, they said, well, that's the list we have in the handbook. So it was a catch-22, so we were stuck. But they came up with other things to help us out, like native alternatives. This list will go down and gives you the list of what's in the ENS handbook, basically, and what to replace it with, now that I woke you up. And what we did was we put this list together. This is right off the webpage. And if you look at it, this is the part that threw me. These items right here are the top items listed for each Piedmont, Mountain, and Coastal. The number one, the tall fescue, is listed in all three for sure at 90 to 100% seed mix. And it's invasive. It will take over if not taken care of. And that's a big issue that we've been trying to tell people for years, but they didn't want to listen. Well, now we've got the support and the documentation, and this is what we presented to S-Power and the solar farms and said, guys, this is what you need to do. But we've taken it up a notch. Every construction site is being presented with this list and saying, if you come out there with any of these seeds in your mixture, you're not going to be approved. You have to use native. And they're not comfortable with that. They don't like it because they say it's not readily available. But as I said, I'm taking plenty of cards of these folks sitting over here, and they're going to help us out. Now with that, I'm ready for any questions. Yes, ma'am. logically, it should be at least 2 years. They're still going to try and push for the 15 to 18 months. And what they're trying to do is see if we do well with the first 400 acres, let's give us a few more acres. Big key that I'm saying, and I've already told them, if we get close to the time of year constraint, which in the book it says from December to March. However, we're finding it's actually from October, late October to March, that you can't get grass to grow because of winter. We get our freezes are earlier, and it's actually being more of an impact to us if we let them sit. And if they seed it and we don't get a couple of good sunny days in there and the grass actually takes, which has happened in November and December, early part of December, if that doesn't happen, we could be sitting there looking at bare ground right up to April 1st. Yes, sir. Technically, this is our agricultural land. It was a farm at one point, but it's been timbered 3 times, I think, 3 different generations. And when it's timbered, they timber all of it at one shot. And now the farmer, you know, at his right, since it's cleared, he could come in and put in 7,000 hogs and not have to worry about it. And nobody could complain or do anything against it. Unless he has a discharge that goes into the streams, and then VDACs will come in and come after him. Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Because when they said, "Oh no, it's a perfect site, you know, it's not impervious," and I sat there and said, "What happens if we get our cloud burst when that thing is perpendicular or parallel? Excuse me, parallel." Yeah. Yes. And the other thing, we went to 2 sites. We went to the Louisa site, Dominion site there, and when we toured their site, they said it took them 4 years to get the grass to take. Well, come to find out, it was an old farm, and they took up the topsoil. One of the dumbest things they could have done. Went down to North Carolina, Currituck County. Went to one of their sites, and we said, "How old is this site?" And they said, "We're 8 months running." And I said, "And you got grass this thick?" They didn't take out the topsoil from the farm. The beans came back in, and they only grew to 4 inches tall. So the other thing we noticed was where they put in native plants on their berm, those native plants within that 8 months had already started to take over the bean field, and they weren't growing any more than the 3 feet. So they didn't even touch the panels. But go ahead. Say that again. Oh, yes, definitely. We've required soil sampling, like on steroids. We told them we're not going to accept just one boring at one select site. We want all, because we know the soils. I'm still worried that then when they start driving those piles, they're going to hit granite, because it's that end of the county that's got a lot of stone. All right, are there any other questions? Oh. Right. The groundwater use that has come up, by right, they can dig a well, but I don't see why they need it. Virginia and the East Coast has something strange where they don't need to always clean the solar panels. Come to find out, because of the amount of rain and winter snows we get, it washes off the solar panels for them. So there's no mechanical reason for them to have water out there other than dust control. But what they are doing is they already went into an agreement with the subdivision, Fawn Lake, which is next door. They've got really poor pressure, water pressure in the first place. These guys are installing a new water line that will get them up to a tank, and they're actually going to increase the pressure of water for Fawn Lake and create a tank for their facility. So they really don't need well water. there any other questions? Yes. Oh, yes, that was from DEQ. They said, you got to look at it again. You know, and there was a way, there are many forms, when you use some of them, like from Wisconsin and all these other locations that have dealt with these kind of panels, they give it 80% impervious for each solar panel. That threw me for a loop. Go ahead, Mike. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm. Well, the other. Yeah. No, well, each locality is going to have to come up with their own. If they listen to what they're told and they do exactly by the book, Mike's right, we're going to have issues. Our contractor is coming up and he's putting in windrows, which is an old farming practice to slow the water down on a flat area. You put those windrows in and have a certain amount of gravel in there, which you're going to have for the travel way between each solar panel, run it through the VRRM, and guess what? It really stops the water. It still works just as it had for the farms years ago. So they're putting in windrows at the same time. So, yep. Are there any other questions? And yeah, I see why everybody does this. It's hard to see y'all back there. Oh, that's right. All right.
Well, we have about 5 more minutes worth of time, so let me just ask, were there any burning questions for either for Jonah or John that you did not get to ask?
Yes, sir. Sorry. I knew he was going to do that. Yeah, Chip.
When the first announcement of the solar farm in Spotsylvania came off, it was mentioned that there was going to be possible timbering with the solar panels. You already spoke that the farmer or the owner of the land had already timbered it, so that wasn't necessarily an issue. But had it still had timber or trees on the property, would Spotsylvania County have allowed for the timbering in place of a solar panel?
It would have gone under our ENS requirements and standards. So it would have been more restrictive than DOF, because DOF only has the perimeter controls and crossings. We wouldn't have allowed crossings unless they had a core permit.
The reason for the question is because a lot of the comments I've been seeing about the project was the intention of why we're looking at converting to solar energy is to get ourselves away from fossil fuels and putting CO into the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're taking away the greatest carbon sink, which are living trees that hold those carbon, and now putting solar panels. So
Right.
you took away one to not help the development. So I didn't know if the all locality was looking at possibly you put solar panels, but it has to be on local land, it cannot be deforestation.
No, not at this time, because we need more information, more facts on exactly what you're stating. The county doesn't have a carbon code. That's our problem. Stafford does. Now, another thing to think about, and DOF will kick me for this, I'm sure, but technically, for the county to take over, the SUP permit has to be approved. We can't even talk to the property owner. We can't even talk to the contractor who took out the trees until the SUP is approved. And at that point, we're actually talking to the person that has the property or control of the property at that point. And then we can actually ask for items. It's not necessarily a snafu, but it's a process that we cannot avoid. And yes, it is an issue. It is a problem. But in the same respect, through the forestry practices, most of what's along the streams have been fallow for 2 years, and it's got better growth than when they had the trees, because the trees were no longer really functioning. Because they were so big, they choked out all the smaller trees for the water quality. Yes, sir. All right. I keep forgetting we got guys upstairs too. Right. Mhm. Right. When it started, there's a term we use with stormwater management. It's called woods is good. So it's basically the site is calculated and everything as if it was still full of woods, full of trees. And that's what we required. Correct, on-site before it could be discharged, yes, and treated on-site. Yeah. Okay. All right. All right, thank you.